Hello and welcome to Third Thursday at Hoover's. I'm so glad you could join us this evening. I'm Brad Reiners, the Communication Director at the Hoover Presidential Foundation. We'll begin the program in a few minutes, but first I have a lot of news to share with you about upcoming events you'll want to participate in. We recently launched a new website called timelessvaluescampaign.org. When you visit that site, you'll learn about a major fundraising campaign for the renovation of the Hoover Presidential Library and Museum exhibit space. It's been about 28 years since the last renovation, and we're excited about bringing new technology and other updates into the museum. You'll also learn about a special benefit for Iowa taxpayers who contribute to the Timeless Values campaign and how to earn a 25% Iowa state tax credit for your gift of any size, no matter how much that gift is. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Thomas Schwartz, the director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum, as tonight's moderator. Tom, we have a lot of interest in tonight's topic. We set a record in registrations, over 250 some registrations with possible 300 some viewers for tonight's presentation.
That's great, Brad, and thanks. Today's presentation is about a successful humanitarian story hidden in the Belgian war lace of 1914 to 1918. Our speaker is Evelyn McMillan, who will discuss how the Brussels Lace Committee, the Hoovers, and two major relief organizations came together to support the lace makers of Belgium during World War I. I invite you to enter questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone else has entered if you'd also like to hear those answered. As we may not have time to answer all the questions provided, top vote getters will be asked first. Evelyn has had a lifelong interest in the textile arts, which led her to research and write about Belgian war lace. She does volunteer work for the Lace Museum of Sunnyvale, California, and recently retired from Stanford University. Thank you for joining us tonight, Evelyn. We are looking forward to hearing your story.
During the brutalities of war, we would never expect such a delicate art form as lace making to survive. But survive it did, and even thrive in Belgium during World War I. How that happened is an exceptional story that involves four determined women who wanted to save the lace makers from destitution, two massive food relief organizations warding off starvation, a young mining engineer who would become president of the United States, a Russian princess, a future first lady, a diplomat's wife, and the only woman delegate of the Commission for Relief in Belgium. What brought all these people together was the need for thread, just simple thread, but thread that could be turned into lace in the hands of a skilled lace maker. First, we need a little background to this story. The Belgian region had always been one of the major lace-making centers of Europe. It was famous for both its needle lace and its bobbin lace. You see examples of the two techniques here. Both are named for the tools that are used to create them. Needle lace is made by building up stitch upon stitch and row upon row until cloth has been created. The basic stitch used is the blanket stitch or the buttonhole stitch, if you know either of those. Bobbin lace is created by weaving and plaiting together threads that are wound on multiple pairs of wooden bobbins, as you see here. The piece that you see represented had required at least 218 pairs of bobbins. The most skilled of all bobbin lacers can be working with over 1,000 bobbins at a time. Lace had been both a national art form and a cottage industry in Belgium. It permitted thousands of women, because the lace makers were almost always women, to augment family income. But the industry was under a lot of pressure even before the war, due to the low wages controlled by middlemen, poor quality education in lace schools, and the ever-growing competition for machine-made lace. In 1911, an organization was formed, Les Amis de la Dentelle, or the Friends of Lace, that came under the patronage of the Belgian Queen, as she wanted to offer her support to the lace makers. This group was making progress in their efforts to improve their lot when the war started, and it seemed that all would be lost because of loss of access to their thread. The thread they used was imported from England and Ireland, sources that were now cut off by a naval blockade established at the start of the war by the British, in an effort to keep Germany from importing food and munitions by sea. This blockade also cut Belgium off from all of their normal importations of food. Belgium was a highly industrialized nation that imported 75% of its food. Within weeks of the start of the war, which was on August 4th, Belgium was facing a famine. Emile Franqui quickly established the Comité National in Brussels to address the problem. In mid-September, the CN sent out a representative seeking food that he could purchase and ship back through the blockade. Being unsuccessful in the Netherlands, he went on to Britain, where he was able to buy food, but was not able to export it. He spent a few difficult weeks trying to cut through the red tape and trying to convince anyone that would listen that the situation in Belgium was serious. Millard Shaler was that CN representative. He was an American mining engineer living in Brussels, just as Herbert Hoover was an American mining engineer living in London. In early October, these two were put in touch with each other by yet a third American mining engineer. Hoover immediately understood the gravity of the situation, as well as the logistics that would be required to meet the need. He had just finished organizing the passage home of over 100,000 Americans trapped in Europe at the start of the war. So he was familiar with large-scale operations, which were run mostly by volunteers. That included himself. In early October, he started putting together the Commission for Relief in Belgium, while working at the same time to secure Britain's permission to ship food through the blockade. 2 US diplomats, Walter Page in London and Brad Whitlock in Brussels, were also working to facilitate this. Germany's promise that they would not seize the food for their own use had already been secured, but Britain's permission was hard to obtain. They felt it was Germany's duty to feed the population of the countries they had invaded and were now occupying. Hoover recognized that starvation of the Belgian citizens would lead to food riots, with brutal German countermeasures and a great loss of life. He eventually was able to convince some of the British officials of the need. Most importantly, he convinced those whose signatures were needed on the shipping orders. Others continued to remain opposed throughout the war. Together, these two organizations, the CN and the CRB, worked in tandem. They oversaw the distribution and preparation of the food within Belgium through the aid of their own vast network of volunteers. The CRB, based in London, oversaw the purchasing of food from around the world, much of it from the United States, Canada, and Argentina, but some coming from places that would be surprising to us, like Mongolia. While a great deal of food was donated, especially flour, the enormous quantities that were needed daily made purchasing necessary for most of it. The food was shipped to the port of Rotterdam, located in the Netherlands, a country that remained neutral throughout the war. From Rotterdam, it was transferred onto canal boats, then sent into Belgium, as well into northern France. They used the area's extensive canal system as the German army controlled the rail lines. Enough food was shipped in to provide a simple meal of soup and bread for over 9 million people every day for 4 years. This is a staggering undertaking when you stop to think about it, and one that cost over $1 billion in the dollars of that time. Of course, there were difficulties that impacted the delivery of food, including poor harvests, freezing weather that hampered transportation, British restrictions on the amount of food that could be shipped in, and German U-boats sinking CRB ships. There were 30 to 50 CRB lease ships en route at all times. The goal was the delivery of over 80,000 tons of food per month. The shortage of ships was their greatest problem, especially from 1916 to 1917. Despite the huge banners on the sides of the ship, as you see here, 52 of them were attacked and 38 of them were sunk, with loss of life and cargo. As these two major food relief organizations were getting underway, 3 Belgian women who had previously been involved in the Queen's effort to aid the lace makers quickly regrouped in order to meet the ever greater need brought on by the war. They persuaded an American woman living in Brussels to join them. Together they formed the core of the Brussels Lace Committee. The Comtesse d'Outremont was a lady-in-waiting to Belgium's Queen Elizabeth. Judging from some of the letters she wrote addressing various problems the committee faced at various times, her executive skills must have been a great asset to the group. Her letters could be very direct when they needed to be. Madame Allard brought her own artistic talents and sense of design to the work. Some of her children were artistic also. Her oldest son contributed a drawing of a family dog that was turned into a pattern for lace made during the war. Madame Kafer Malley was the group's expert lace maker and contributed both her technical skills and her knowledge of the history of lace. You see an example of one of her books that she wrote on this subject that was published right before the war started. The Vicomtesse de Berghem was an American married to a Belgian nobleman. Unfortunately, a photo for her has not yet been identified. All you see here is her headstone in Rock Creek Cemetery. Because she returned to the United States a few years after her husband's death in 1926 and lived the rest of her life in Washington, D.C. In 1975, she donated her own collection of Belgian war lace to the Smithsonian. The piece that you see here is one of the new designs created by the Lace Committee during the war. It was she who brought the plight of the now unemployed lace workers to the attention of Herbert Hoover. In an oral history interview that she gave in 1966 for the Presidential Library there, she recounted that when she learned that Hoover was coming into Belgium on one of his trips to check on the work of the CRB, she asked Madame Allard to host them both so that she would have an opportunity to talk to him. This may have been his trip in January of 1915. When they met at the Allards' home, she recalls that Hoover started the conversation with, "It appears you have something to say to me." To which she replied, "Yes, I do, and it's very important." She then explained the lack of thread and the destitution the unemployed lace makers were facing. She said he listened without expression until she had finished, and then just silently sat there. Finally, he looked at her and said that if she and the other members of the Lace Committee could guarantee that none of the lace would be sold to the Germans, he would be willing to negotiate to bring it through the thread through the blockade, just as he had negotiated with Germany and Britain to bring the food through. The British imposed 2 conditions to further ensure that nothing would fall into the hands of the Germans, who were themselves actively trying to control the lace industry. The conditions were that the finished lace had to be exported and sold from outside of Belgium, and that the weight of the exported thread had to equal exactly the weight of the imported thread. Money for the initial startup costs of this endeavor came from the CRB, the CN, and the American Red Cross. The financial support of the CRB and the CN was ongoing throughout the war. Most of the lace made during the war followed the traditional patterns that had been made in the Belgian region for centuries. Therefore, it would be hard for us to identify it now as lace from that time period without such documentation as a photograph that was taken then, or a label that is still attached. However, the Lace Committee did solicit new designs from noted Belgian artists, as well as having their own in-house staff of designers. Over 2,000 new designs were created, and the original designs for many of these are preserved in the archives of the Art and History Museum in Brussels. It's these new designs that have now become recognizable to us as lace made during the war. Popular designs included the coats of arms of the Allies, the coats of arms of the Belgian provinces, and the coats of arms of the destroyed cities, known as the burned or martyred cities, like Louvain. Mrs. Hoover was given a tablecloth with the coats of arms of these martyred cities, and hopefully that is still in the family. Oak leaves were another popular motif as they represented strength. We will see some examples of these designs, including the coats of arms of the Allies and the oak leaves, later on in this talk. On an earlier slide, you saw a piece with a Belgian lion done in needle lace, and you will be seeing more lions as we go along. We know the names of at least 24 artists who created designs for the Lace Committee, but we're only going to talk about 2 of them here. The 2 who happened to be the most famous in Belgium at the time. Isidore de Ruyter was known for his sculptures, and he designed some of the most symbolic and also the most monumental of pieces. But the latter are in museums in Europe, and this evening we are focusing on pieces that were made in the United States. What you see here is a cushion cover in the collection of the Smithsonian, a gift from the Viscountess de Burghem. It commemorates the Battle of the Yser, where the Belgian army defeated the German army. This victory kept one small part of the country free. It was achieved by opening sea gates and flooding the low-lying fields, thus making it impossible for the German army to cross. When the gates were opened, sea life was swept in with the water. You see starfish, eels, a crab, and seaweed represented in this piece. Eels have never been more beautiful, have they? Bernard Knauf was another noted Belgian artist, and while yet again his most monumental pieces are in Europe, a charming fan designed by him is in the Presidential Library there in Iowa. The symbolic animals of the Allies appear on this delicate fan leaf. You might be able to make the Belgian lion out at the top in the center. It is flanked by the dates of 1914 and 1915, which might be a little bit easier to read on this slide. The artist's name is given in the lower left-hand corner of the fan. We need to talk about the logistics of bringing the thread into the country and getting the finished lace out. One of the CRB delegates, seen here, Milton Brown, whose grandson is with us this evening, was in charge of ordering the lace thread. His orders ran to literally tons and tons of thread. It takes a lot of thread to keep 50,000 lace makers busy. The lace reached the workers on the same canal barges bringing in the food from Rotterdam. Each district had its own local committee. They handed out the patterns to be used, the thread needed, and the wages for the finished lace. Each lace maker was paid 3 francs a week, which is more than double what the majority of them had been making per week before the war. The finished lace was returned to Brussels on the canal boats. All of this would have been a very complex operation under the best of circumstances, and these were the worst of circumstances. Some of the most famous lace-making regions were trapped behind the fighting lines in what were known as the war zones. You see them on the map to the west of Brussels. Within these zones, the local population was not allowed to exit or re-enter on pain of death. So getting the thread in and the finished lace out of these zones seems to have involved some smuggling when necessary. Here is one instance. When a nun from Bruges walked into the headquarters of the Lace Committee in Brussels, the staff was horrified. They protested that they had not sent for her and she should not have risked crossing the war zone lines, as she could have been shot for doing so. She explained she had to do it because the women had run out of thread and needed their wages. With that explanation, she then proceeded to bring out yards and yards of lace from under her habit. She tucked the necessary skeins of thread back under, collected their packet of wages, and made the dangerous trek back across the war zone border. From Brussels, the lace was sent to Rotterdam and then on to the CRB offices in London. From there, the orders were filled for buyers and department stores, mostly located in London, Paris, and the United States. The record books list names that will be familiar to you. Selfridges in London, Macy's in New York, Filene's in Boston, and Marshall Field's in Chicago. This was in keeping with the British demand that it be sold outside of Belgium. However, there seems to have been one exception, as lace was sold in a few Belgian cities during the summer of 1915, but alas, sales were disappointing. You can well imagine the difficulties of trying to sell such a luxurious item as lace during the austerities of war. To overcome this, the buying of lace was promoted as a patriotic and humanitarian act. It was a way in which the purchaser could extend their personal and financial support to the besieged lace makers of Belgium. This evocative poster was created for the CRB to help make that connection. And you see here the pensive lace maker with a piece of her lace on her hand, looking out at the devastation of her town. This would help the potential buyer make a connection to the lace makers. In addition to the women of the Brussels Lace Committee, other women were offered significant support, and 4 will be highlighted here. We can start with Mrs. Hoover. She is seen here in 2 photographs. The one on the right was taken during one of the fairs put on each year to raise money for the CRB here in Palo Alto. If you're wondering what she was doing in California when they were living in London, remember that she tried to bring her sons home to California each summer. So that is how she came to be photographed standing next to Mrs. Timothy Hopkins at the fair. Mrs. Hoover is the one in the photo on the right, on the photo, laughing. I love this picture of her. The other was the official White House photograph done in 1928. She wears a dress of white chiffon that she had made specifically to showcase the wide piece of lace on the lower half of her shawl. This lace had been a gift to her from the Vicomtesse de Berghem, who was delighted to see Mrs. Hoover wearing it at a White House dinner party she was invited to soon after her return to the United States. The order books of the London Lace Office record Mrs. Hoover's many purchases of lace during these years. She also joined Lady Egerton, who we'll hear about soon, in promoting lace sales in London, and was active in helping with the last of the sales after the war. In December of 1917, she loaned a piece to an exhibit that was held in London to generate sales, which it successfully did. What she loaned was the needle lace tablecloth that had been given to her by the lace makers in gratitude for her support. In the center of the cloth is a banner that runs between the cherubs with her name on it, as well as their words of thanks and the dates of 1914, 1915, and 1916. These dates are followed by a question mark, standing in for the still unknown final years of the war. This magnificent tablecloth was also designed by Isidore de Ruyter, with perhaps a collaboration with his sister Maria on the cherubs, as she was an artist also. It is now at the Hoover Institution here in California. It would have taken 30 of Belgium's finest needle lace workers at least 3 months to prepare such a large and complex piece. It is 69 inches across. Each worker would have had her own specialty, be it cherubs, heraldic lions, eagles, stars, or flowers. Another group of skilled workers would have then assembled these separately made components into the finished cloth. Please note the 4 American eagles whose outstretched wings can be seen as perhaps sheltering the 4 Belgian lions in the corners who are encircled in chains, the chains representing the German occupation of their country. The photographs that were taken here that you see of this cloth were done when it was on exhibit in the Lou Henry Hoover room of the Hoover Tower. It is no longer on exhibit, is down in their archives. The Hoover Institution here owns 13 pieces of Belgian lace that previously belonged to the Hoovers. The Presidential Library in Iowa owns another 13 of their pieces. While alas, there isn't time to show you the photographs of all of these pieces, we will look at one more of Mrs. Hoover's. This tablecloth features the coats of arms of the Allied nations and has her monogram worked in needle lace. Here again, the years of the war are followed by a question mark, which you can see beneath her initials. There is delightful documentation about this piece in the archives there, as she wrote out its history when she gifted it to her niece, Louise. She tells of the guests that were served tea from it and of the family weddings where it covered the cake table. It was Louise who had the cloth placed in this glass top table that you see here in the photo. In addition to the coats of arms made in needle lace, you see bobbin lace surrounding them. Next, we will talk about Mrs. Whitlock, the wife of Brand Whitlock, the United States diplomat to Belgium during the war, as mentioned earlier. As you know, she was the honorary president of the Lace Committee and an active participant. She worked to encourage sales in the United States and bought lace to give to family and friends. She accepted orders from the visitors who came to have tea with her and the visitors who came calling on her husband with official business. These orders she forwarded on to London for fulfillment. In the photograph of her on the deck of a ship, she's holding both her dog and a fur muff. The dog is on the right. This photograph may have been taken in December of 1915 when they returned to the United States on diplomatic business. The lace workers also honored her with the gift of a special tablecloth on which her name, with their words of gratitude, are embroidered on the outer cloth border. It too is now at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Their website has many excellent photos of this cloth, including close-ups of the inscription, which is hard to see here as the embroidery thread matches exactly the beautiful cream color of this cloth. The workmanship on this cloth is exquisite. A lovely portrait of Mrs. Whitlock was painted by Firmin Bayes in Brussels during or right after the war. A photograph of the painting was published in the press in 1920, and that is what you see here. Where this portrait is now is unknown. Mrs. Whitlock died in upstate New York in 1942. It is not mentioned in her will, nor does it seem to be in any of the museums that hold portraits of her husband. Hopefully someone hearing this knows where it is. In London, Lady Egerton, who was born a Russian princess, was involved with the lace effort from the very beginning. She was head of the London Lace Department. She also opened a retail store as well as a workroom where the lace was sewn on garments and household furnishings to expand its market appeal. Her work for the lace effort was made all the more poignant given the losses the war years brought to her. Her husband died in 1916 just a few months after the death of their only child, who had left Oxford at age 17 to fight in the war and died of his wounds there at age 19. Another key supporter of the LACE effort was Mrs. Kellogg, who was the only woman delegate of the CRB. Many other women were involved in the work of the CRB, both as paid staff members or as volunteers. But of the over 150 delegates who served with the CRB, she was the only woman. The CRB delegates served within Belgium and northern France, facilitating the distribution of food and seeing that the British imposed regulations were adhered to. They themselves were all volunteers. Only their living expenses were paid. Mrs. Kellogg's husband, Professor Vernon Kellogg of Stanford University, was one of the directors of the work, serving in both Belgium and in northern France. Mrs. Kellogg brought her considerable writing talents to the job and produced 2 books on the work of Belgian women during the war years. Herbert Hoover asked her to write the first book, as he wanted the world to know about the many charitable organizations headed by women that were providing aid in their country. Women of Belgium was published in 1917. It contained 1 chapter on the LACE effort. She expanded on that in her second book, Bobbins of Belgium, published in 1920. This second book recorded the struggles of the lace makers during the war. Much of her research for this book took place as soon as the guns fell silent. She traveled in the bitter winter months of November, December, and January on war-torn roads, visiting damaged and unheated convents, lace schools, and homes to learn about the lace makers' experiences during the war. In the preface to this book, she says, "I entered the lace world by the grim door of war, for it was the wartime work of the women of the Brussels Lace Committee that opened the way for me." It was the combined efforts of all of these people, as well as many others, who helped the lace workers survive the war with their skills in artistry and tact. The Belgian handmade lace industry not only survived, but it even thrived during those 4 years. Everyone involved in the effort hoped that their successes achieved during the war would continue on, but unfortunately, that was not to be. Without the support of the CRB and the CN, and with the simpler modes of dress that arose during the war, coupled with the ever-increasing production of machine-made lace, the market for handmade lace declined rapidly. However, this decline does not diminish what the members of the Lace Committee and their supporters accomplished during the war. We owe them our appreciation and our acknowledgement for their remarkable humanitarian undertaking during those difficult years. An undertaking that was woven through with courage, dedication, and determination. And it was all based on the need for thread, just simple, vital thread. Thank you. And thank you for letting me share this subject with you. It is one that has fascinated me for more than 10 years now. My original research was just to satisfy my own curiosity. But by 2015, I felt that this was an important story that needed to be kept alive. My first article was published in 2017, with another in 2020, and I have other pieces that are forthcoming. Your listening this evening helps to keep the story alive, and that means a lot to me. I hope some of you will have questions for me now, and I can also be reached by email at lacehistory@gmail.com. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you so much, Evelyn. So now's the time for Q&A. The some have also posted comments in the chat. Let me start with a question that I have, actually a couple. Do we know how large the lace collection is in the Smithsonian that was given to them
Yes.
by the?
It's 42 pieces, and that will come up in a resource slide later on.
Okay.
There are also 72 pieces in Brussels at the Museum of Art and History, 13, as mentioned, at both of the Hoovers, and the Lace Museum in Sunnyvale holds 31 pieces. Several of those are the exact same motifs done in a set of doilies.
Do we have, or do you have any idea of how much is still in private hands?
No, I have no idea whatsoever. I do occasionally hear from delegates' families who have inherited pieces, and I help identify them for them. So I know there is some out there, but no total idea of it at all.
Because you referred to Jeff Miller, who is the great-grandson of Milton Brown, and we didn't even know that he had all of Milton Brown's papers. So, you know, stuff keeps turning up. So
I hope so.
now, I know that with the flour sacks, but I've also, in looking at those lovely examples of lace that you showed, you know, when the Germans entered Belgium and occupied it, they tried to force the Belgians to revert to Berlin time. And an act of subversion was to stay on Belgian time. But I also noticed that the use of patriotic symbols in the lace, such as the Belgian lion and flag, which were again kind of banned by the Germans in public display, the Belgians used in all of these gifts that they were sending abroad. So, I mean, was kind of lace making, did it become kind of in some ways a subversive activity where they could express their patriotism, which they couldn't do, you know, in a public sense in Belgium?
Yes, I definitely think so. And Milton Brown talks about that in his oral interview that he did for the Hoover there. And he talks about how, yes, patriotic symbols were forbidden, which he says was strictly meat to the Belgians. They then jumped right on it. He also talks about smuggling lace out in that same interview, with lace with patriotic images on it. He says he would call around to the members of the Lace Committee and say that he was actually making a trip to Rotterdam the next day, and they would say, "Oh, do come back about 5 p.m. And he would go back and gather up these pieces of lace, and he says, put them under his clothing and take them out with him. The tolerance for it seems to have changed, because certainly there were patriotic motifs in the lace that was publicly exhibited in Belgium in 1915. And then I think was later clamped down on. That's part of one of the mysteries about this, because of course all the flowers, so many of the flour sacks have Belgian flags and other things on it. So right. What the situation was exactly isn't totally known to me at all.
Okay, the question we have from Mark, I assume that the lace makers made money on the exported goods. How was the money processed around the various blockades? How was it kept out of German hands?
Well, Germany had agreed. That was one of the things that Hoover negotiated, that they would not seize the lace or the wages. So the local committees did hand out the wages. Getting the money in and out had some problems, as you know. And at the end of the war, according to Vicomtesse de Berghem, after they had paid all the lace makers, there was still a profit. And this they then, she says, put into a collection or something that was about that showed the history of lace. The exact records on this are totally incomplete. If anyone knows more, I'd love to hear about it.
Good friend Jeff Miller asks, after all your years of research, what are a few of the most surprising things you've learned?
How interested people are in this. I thought it was just me. Everything about it has been absolutely fascinating, and it's been interesting to me how it has rippled out over and over since I wrote that first article. I never expected that. I never expected that this would take over a huge portion of my life, which I've been thrilled to let it do. And retiring from Stanford 3 weeks ago has permitted me to focus on this from now on, which is what I hope to do.
So Lori indicates pieces of lace with the metal CRB tag often show up on eBay. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am. I'm not familiar with them showing up often. I am familiar with them showing up occasionally.
Okay.
I hope she's right. The Smithsonian has a few pieces with the tags or the paper labels still attached.
Yeah. Kimberly writes, there are pieces at Hillwood in DC, Marjorie Merriweather Post's home.
Thank you. I'm going to make a note of that. I try to keep a list of where pieces are located. There are some in the Met in New York. They have about 8 pieces. The ones I listed are places that have more than 10 pieces.
Sherry asks, what first drew you to this topic?
I've loved textiles all my life. I remember being fascinated by embroidery at age 3 as my mother would embroider on my dresses. I've known the CRB story all of my life also because I grew up within the shadow of Hoover Tower. My parents always took me there. They had a much broader view of Herbert Hoover than most Americans. And they explained to me before I wasn't old enough to read the placards about the CRB and the work that he had done. So I was seeing the lace and the flour sacks from the very beginning. I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't know this story, didn't know the lace and the flour sacks. So all of those, and I've always loved history, so all of those came together. I've collected textiles all of my life also. I have pieces I got when I was 5 years old that I still have. I started being more and more interested in lace in the 1990s, and then became fascinated with the war lace because that brought 3 things of great interest together to me: textiles, history, and the CRB.
Cindy asks, where are your articles published?
My 2 published articles on this are in Pieceworks magazines. That will show up in a slide at the very end that tells where information can be found. The first one was published in 2017 in the May-June issue of Pieceworks. The second one was published in the spring issue of 2020. They may be available on Pieceworks website.
Okay. Maureen asks, the woman who died in upstate New York and you would like to find her painting, where in New York State did she live? I live in upstate and have access to a few archives.
She lived in Brewster. She lived with a friend and she lived in Brewster. If this person wants to email me at lacehistory@gmail.com, I can share what information I have found on this. I was actually able to track down a great nephew of hers. The Whitlocks had no children that survived more than a few hours after their birth. So all of her household furnishings were left in her will to a nephew on the Brainerd side of the family. And a descendant of that man lives here in San Francisco. He's an attorney in San Francisco. And I had hoped that perhaps the painting was with them. I contacted him, sent him the photo press release and said, do you have this? And they said, no, they don't. They did have a lot of the Whitlock papers, which they donated to the Hoover Institution here.
Peggy wants to know, are there still lace-making schools in Belgium?
Not formal schools. There's certainly lace-making classes. Fabulous lace is still being made in Belgium, but not as an industry, not for money. It's what people who enjoy making it do for themselves. There was a fabulous tour of the lace centers, or the lace cities, the most famous lace cities, in 2018 that some of us got to go on, and we saw amazing pieces of contemporary lace being made there.
Mark asks, have you been able to speak to people who spoke to people directly involved in the story, such as their children or grandchildren?
Yes, I have. I've been in touch with descendants, and some descendants have found me and gotten in touch with me. That's been really exciting. These two oral histories are really valuable because they were given by the people that were living through it, Milton Brown and the Viscountess of de Burgham. So I'm very glad to have them. There's an oral history from Mrs. Hoover's dressmaker, and she talks about that chiffon dress with the lace shawl that was shown in an earlier slide. It was really fun to get to read her oral interview also and have that dress come up.
I often wonder if the design of the home that Mrs. Hoover created for Palo Alto, where their home in Palo Alto, which is now the home of the president of Stanford. There was a specific room design, the Belgian room, and I've always wondered if there are photographs that show how they decorated that room with the lace and the flour sacks, and I've yet to come across one.
Yes, I'd love to see a picture of that too. It's certainly on the plans. There are also letters, and I can't remember which Hoover they're at, but I do have copies of them, where she wrote to a famous architect in Brussels asking for guidance from him on the ways she should display her lace in that room and the ways she should display the flour sacks, and how she could have what recommendations he had for ways of storing them in the room in which it would be very easy to bring them out and display them. So this was an interesting concern to her.
Let's see. We'll do one more. Peggy asks, where can one access the oral histories? And I think she's referring, well, the ones that are at both the Hoover Institution and also the Hoover Presidential Library Museum, where there are transcripts. Now, I know that we have scanned ours, but haven't put them online yet. But you can get them when the reading room research reopens. So my host here is telling me that that's all the time we have for questions for now. I'd like to thank our speaker, Evelyn McMillan, for her presentation tonight, and also all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. Remember, the Presidential Library is now open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5, with, well, that should be Presidential Museum, with time ticketing. The library is still closed, unfortunately. Don't miss our next temporary exhibit, opening next Saturday, February 26th, called Hooverheads, featuring numerous original artworks that capture the likeness of Herbert Hoover. The National Historic Site and historic buildings and visitor center are also open for you to enjoy and to explore. And don't forget to join us Thursday, March 17th, as our own National Historic Site Ranger, Jenny Davis, presents The Progression of America's National Parks. Registration is now open for that program on hooverpresidentialfoundation.org, or go through your favorite public library. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus and museum renovation. You can learn more about that and even show your support at timelessvaluescampaign.org. Also, remember, Monday, February 21st is President's Day. So celebrate by reading a presidential biography, preferably one on Herbert Hoover. On behalf of all of us at the Hoover campus and participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus.